Hey everyone! As you might have heard, Amanda Morin and I have written a new book, Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported. At the time of this recording, the book will be released tomorrow on Tuesday, January 21st. To go along with this book, we've created a limited series podcast. The Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools podcast features Amanda and me as we discuss the important principles we cover in our book. We've got some excellent interviews to elaborate on the topics we cover, and you'll get to hear just a bit of the ridiculousness that occurs when two neurodivergent brains get together to write a book. We're releasing the first episode of that podcast here today, but be sure to find the Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools feed in your podcast app and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And of course, you can order your book right away. Okay, here's the first episode of Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools.
Welcome to the Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools podcast. I'm Amanda Morin.
And I am Emily Kircher-Morris.
And we are here together having this conversation and talking with all of you about creating neurodiversity-affirming schools because
we have a new book coming out. It's coming out January 21st, 2025. So if you are listening before that date, it is available for pre-order, or if you are listening afterwards, of course, you can order it. The title of our new book is Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported.
And we were really excited about the idea of putting together a podcast that could talk through more of the concepts that we have in the book, so we could have a conversation with all of those educators out there, you, whoever's listening today, and who will continue to listen, about what does it really look like to create neurodiversity-affirming schools and putting those practices literally into practice. So we wanted to have that conversation with you. But it probably would help if you know who you're talking to. So Emily, why don't we introduce ourselves?
Sure. Yeah. So again, I'm Emily, and a little bit about my background. So first of all, I am neurodivergent. I was identified with ADHD when I was a kid. I was also in a gifted program, but that was before we even used the term twice exceptional. I also always mention the fact that I was diagnosed before Asperger's was even in the DSM, which is no longer in the DSM, of course. It's all under that autism diagnosis. But I always know that, like, if I was a child today, we would have looked at that piece because I see a lot of those traits in myself, although I don't officially have that diagnosis. But beyond that, school was really tough, and I wanted to change things. I wanted to make things better for students because it had been so difficult for me. So I started my career in education. I taught in the gen ed classroom. I taught in the gifted ed classroom. I have a master's in gifted ed, but I went back and got a second master's in counseling. And so I am a licensed professional counselor, and I support neurodivergent people of all ages, kids, teens, adults, and their families, and do a lot of advocacy in the schools. I also am the parent to 3 neurodivergent children. Currently, they are 16, 14, and 9. But this is my passion. I'm also the host of the Neurodiversity podcast. So how about you, Amanda? Tell everyone a little bit about your background.
Sure. And as I said, I'm Amanda Morin. I'm also neurodivergent, which has made for an interesting conversation throughout this process with Emily and I, because we have neurodivergent brains that go in all sorts of directions, which is fantastic. When I went through school, I didn't have a formal identification because I'm just enough older, I think, that I was at the time when that wasn't looked at as much in young girls. I have significant sensory processing issues. I have OCD, I have anxiety, all of those things that, again, if we put them together today, and I went back to be diagnosed 20 years ago, I think probably would fall under an autism umbrella. So I somewhat self-identify as autistic, and that in part is because of my 3 children who are neurodivergent, who are at this time 28, 22, and 14. 2 of them are autistic. One is what we call an ADHDer. He has ADHD and autism. And I started my career in education as well. It was important to me to be in the classroom supporting kids who were the kids like me, who didn't have somebody who understood what it was like to feel a little off kilter in a classroom and not have the ways of learning that were helpful to them. So I started my career in elementary education, and then went on to work in early intervention. So I was working with both kids and families, which was so rewarding. And I loved that so much. Over time, I went into parent training through writing. So I've done a lot of writing. I've written a number of books and done that because I think there's a lack of information out there in ways that people can really understand and make use of. And that was really important to me. So now I work with kids one-on-one. I do a lot of executive function coaching, and I do parent training to help parents figure out what does it look like to put into place a neurodiversity-affirming environment in their homes. And like Emily, I work with educators on a regular basis and have those conversations about how can we improve the systems in which our kids are being taught so that they can feel accepted and supported.
And I think it's also just interesting to share with everybody a little bit about how we met and how we kind of became friends and started on this project. Yeah. Like many neurodivergent people, sometimes it's hard to find like-minded peers. And so Amanda and I met originally on the platform formerly known as Twitter.
May it rest in peace.
May it rest in peace. And so, we had kind of connected, and I invited her to be on my podcast. And then, things just kind of moved from there.
I think it's probably important to note, I didn't mention that I'm also a special education advocate, right? And so that was one of the conversations we had when we first met, was around special education and twice exceptionality and neurodivergence. And what I think is great about this story is we had conversation after conversation online for years, literally years, and, met through video and the podcast, and didn't really actually meet in person until we'd already started writing this book.
That's true.
But it was that like-minded community. It was really an exceptional thing to be able to meet somebody and have conversations where you didn't have to explain yourself, right? And I think that's one thing that was really important. And then what ended up happening is we had sort of bonded over writing books, because we were writing at the same time. We were writing separate books. Both of us had books released around the same time. And if you haven't written a book, it's very rewarding, and it's also quite a grind, right? I mean, there's a lot that goes into it.
Yes.
We bonded over that. And then one day Emily was like, I have an idea for another book. And we talked it over and started writing this book after, going through the process of making sure the publisher was interested, that we really thought it had an audience. And here we are.
I think it's also fair to mention that we're married to different people, but they are basically the same person in many ways.
That's fair.
They're both audiophiles. So all of these different things. We're also parent to kids who have a lot of similarities. We both experienced things as students as well that really helped us kind of align with this. So yes. This is a limited series podcast. We may end up releasing more episodes in the future. So this is season 1. But ultimately, we are going to have an episode that aligns with each chapter of our book. So technically, there are 12 chapters in the book. We're going to do 13 episodes, this being the one that aligns with the introduction specifically, and just talk through some of the topics and pieces that we really want to dive into a little bit more within each of those chapters.
And I think it would be fair to say, like, this conversation we're going to have today is about why now? Why are we talking about neurodivergence, neurodiversity, and all of those things now as it comes to education? And part of it is because neurodiversity is having this moment. Mm-hmm. People are talking about it. People are talking about it in workplaces. They're talking about it in schools. They're talking about it on social media platforms. And it's time to see, how do we integrate what people are talking about how their brains work, into school systems, and how we can meet the needs of all the different brains in our schools.
Yeah. The other reason that it is happening now, is because there are people like Amanda, like me, who were neurodivergent, and we are now adults, and we understand that part of ourselves. And so we are able to advocate. I always mention this fact. I think it's fascinating. So let's be honest. The neurodiversity movement really evolved out of the autistic community. That's really where it kind of started from. And it's grown to be broader than just that small group of people. However, as I mentioned earlier, Asperger's at the time was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1994. So prior to 1994, there was an autism diagnosis that could be given, but it was specifically for individuals who were primarily non-speaking with very significant disabilities, And it would not have covered many of the people who would have fit into autism spectrum or Asperger's at the time. So my first year teaching was the 2001-2002 school year. And halfway through the school year, the school counselor came into my classroom and said, you know that student so-and-so? I think he has this thing I just learned about at the state school counselors conference called Asperger's. I had never heard of it. I was a first-year teacher. I had never heard of this at all. The school counselor who'd been there for probably 20 years had never heard of it. And so that was only a little over 20 years ago. That student, who was a third grade student at that point in time, he's now like in his mid-30s. And so when we talk about why now, it's like, who has the voice?
Right.
Who's able to make these changes? And until people even know that about themselves, they're not able to take those steps to say, hey, this is what I experienced. This is why I experienced it. This is why it didn't work. And this is what we need to do differently. And that's part of where those voices come from, and that we're hoping to really make that change in the schools.
I think that's such a great point, and really worth emphasizing that in education, 20 odd years is not that long amount of time, right? So all of those students that we've had over time who have come to understand themselves, they are not only speaking for themselves, but they've helped a lot of parents understand that they may also be neurodivergent, or teachers understand. I know for me, it was a realization that really hit home when I was in the classroom and realized, oh, the reason I identify so much with the kids I'm working with is because they remind me of a young me. And that was a sort of a powerful moment for me in terms of realizing what my own needs and accommodations are. One thing that we keep doing, though, is we use the word neurodivergent and talk about the neurodiversity movement. And I think it's really probably important to explain to people why we're using two different words. I would start by saying the neurodiversity movement itself is a ground up movement. As Emily mentioned, it started with the autistic community, and we cannot give enough credit to the actually autistic movement, where autistic voices really came together to speak up about what it's like to be in a neurodivergent brain and what the needs are, right? And the fact that it's expanded, this community has expanded, has made us really talk about what's called a neurodiversity movement. But when we talk about neurodiversity, we're talking about everybody, right? Everybody is neurodiverse. We all have ways that our nervous systems interact with the world. And I think it's often used interchangeably with the word neurodivergent because people haven't heard the word neurodivergent as much. There's no neurodivergent movement, right? There's a neurodiversity movement. And as we've had a greater understanding of the difference between a neurodiverse population where everybody's neurotype, everybody's brain contributes to society in some way, and that what the other thing we're talking about is when people's nervous systems and brains and the way that they interact with the world makes it a little more challenging to interact with the world that exists around them. Because I think we often hear people talk about neurodivergence or ADHD or autism as a superpower, but I really want to acknowledge that there are challenges. There are absolutely challenges that go with living inside a nervous system and a brain, right? That interacts with a world that maybe isn't set up for you. As I sit here in my home office, I have the privilege of turning the lights down, the heat down and up, and all of those things to adjust to my sensory system. I can't do that in the rest of the world. And so that neurodivergence, the way my brain and system diverges from what we consider to be, I don't like the word typical. I don't like the word norm. I don't like any of those words, but I use those words because those are the only ones we have to use right now.
Yeah. And I think that's the piece, is recognizing that certain people have neurotypes that diverge from what we would generally consider the norm or typical, again, using those terms. But I think realizing that not everybody is neurodivergent, right? Our entire audience, everybody who's listening to us right now, it is a neurodiverse group of people. We are neurodiverse together. If you are a teacher in schools, you are a teacher of a neurodiverse school, or your classroom is neurodiverse, but you have some students who are neurodivergent. So we know that kids who are neurodivergent need something different, because think about it from a curriculum standpoint. A curriculum is created for, if you look at a bell curve, the middle part of that bell curve. And you have these outliers. And you can have outliers on any particular trait, which brings us actually to this term that we often talk about. You'll hear people using the term neurotypical, but Amanda and I actually prefer not to use that term. We used to. I used to use it all the time.
Oh, me too.
But I've moved away from it. And so, Amanda, why don't you kind of explain a little bit how we evolved through that, really, when we were working on the book?
Sure. I mean, and neurotypical is a word that people use really often as an opposite of neurodivergent. And I think that's important to note. Like Emily said, I evolved over time too. I know that I think about the fact that there's probably stuff that I've written out there that still uses neurotypical. And I want to acknowledge that, because I think that it's important to say, like, I have evolved over time, and sometimes the writings that I've done cannot evolve over time because they're permanent. But we really came to this concept of the fact that when we talk about typical, there isn't a typical. What typical is a set of standards or expectations that as sort of a society we've agreed upon. And the fact of the matter is, I don't know that we have agreed upon it, right? What they actually are is a set of norms. And it's sort of norms that we would expect people to fall into, look like, meet, those kinds of things. And so when we talk about neurodivergent, the opposite isn't typical, right? Because people aren't supposed to be a certain kind of way. The opposite is really neuro-normative, the way that people's brains, their expectations, their behaviors, the way they show up in the world meets the norms that society has set out for us. And so our evolution was to realize, like, there needs to be a more neutral term. And I'm not sure neuro-normative will stay, because it's not necessarily neutral either, but it's a less weighted word, right? It doesn't put any sort of moral judgment in a way. It just says there are these norms, they exist, and there are people who are meeting those norms on a regular basis because that's just the way they live in the world. And people who are neurodivergent may not be meeting all of those norms. So we tend to use neuro-normative. I'd encourage other people to think about using it too, but language evolves and how we use it evolves. And so you will hear us talk that way and use the phrase neuro-normative as opposed to neurotypical.
I think another piece to just clearly define is when we were talking about what really neurodivergent means specifically. And so anytime you're talking about this, we're often talking about medical diagnoses or educational identifications, all these different labels that we use, which, to be fair, let's recognize the fact that it would be wonderful if we lived in a world where we didn't need labels and where people were able to access whatever it was that they needed. But that's not the world that we live in. And we do need labels, especially in the education world, because it is the doorway to services and supports. But when we're talking about neurodivergent diagnoses, there are some labels that kind of fit into that category and others that really don't. So the way that we conceptualize this, and we explain it in the book, is that you have diagnoses that are considered neurodivergent diagnoses, and then you have other diagnoses that are considered more psychological or mental health diagnoses. So labels like ADHD, autism, specific learning disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, things like epilepsy and Tourette's, those are diagnoses that really do kind of fit under that neurodivergent umbrella. Labels that are more associated with like a psychological diagnosis, like generalized anxiety or depression, those are things that aren't part of neurodivergence, although they are part of neurodiversity, right? Because that's the whole point, is that we have this big area here. And the reason that we feel like it's really important to designate those two things is because we are talking about being neurodiversity affirming. And when we talk about being neurodiversity affirming, what that really means is like, how do we work with somebody's brain instead of against it? How do we support kids in using their neurology in a way that is effective for them? And as a clinician, when I'm doing counseling, when I have somebody who comes in and is dealing with anxiety, I'm going to address that much differently than I do when somebody comes in because they're autistic. So when someone comes in and they're dealing with anxiety, I can be validating, I can express support for that, but ultimately my goal is to make the anxiety go away if possible.
Right.
It can be episodic, it is treatable, it can come and go. Now, there are definitely people who experience chronic generalized anxiety, and that definitely is something that impacts them on a day-to-day basis, and I don't want to minimize that. But when we're talking about a neurodivergent diagnosis, when I have a client who comes into my office because they are autistic, my goal is not to make them not autistic. My goal is not to make them look like they're not autistic. My goal is to help them navigate a world that wasn't created for them. And so it has to do with the approach that we take, why it's beneficial to separate out those two. Now, there are some other labels that I would say kind of go in the middle of these. So, for example, like bipolar disorder, it is neurobiological in origin. It's not going to go away, but we really can treat it and very much minimize it. So it's kind of in the middle of a neurodivergent and a psychological or a mental health diagnosis. Obsessive compulsive thinking is another one, right? That kind of goes a little bit in both. Like for some people, obsessive compulsive thinking really can be episodic. We can treat it and go away. But for others, it's much more pervasive and much more chronic. And so just part of their day-to-day life. And so we want to, again, support that in ways that help them operate in a world that maybe wasn't always created for them.
And I would add that there's some overlap sometimes, right? It's not in isolation.
Right.
Like it's not in isolation. You can have somebody who is autistic and also experiencing anxiety.
Totally.
And in that case, your goal as a clinician is to help them navigate the world as an autistic person and to minimize the anxiety. And I think that's a really good way to look at the difference there, is to be able to say, in this one person, there's one thing that we're trying to treat specifically, and one thing we're trying to figure out how they can be themselves in the world too. The other thing that I noticed, Emily, that we're doing that we didn't even talk about is using that identity first language component, right? I talked about my sons being autistic, me sort of self-identifying as autistic. We talk about being neurodivergent. For educators, that's a tricky thing. And it's really important for me to bring that up because most of us, the majority of us, went through school having been taught that we should be using person-first language. So a student who has ADHD, a student with autism, a student who experiences anxiety, right? That's that person-first component versus a student who is autistic, a student who's an ADHDer, right? Those kinds of language changes. I personally use identity-first language because I can't separate out those pieces of myself from my identity. And that's a fairly common thing that you hear in activist and advocate communities is that reclaiming of the identity and saying, I don't know what it's like to be any other version of myself. I can't separate the neurodivergence. I can't separate being autistic. I can't separate having ADHD. I can't separate any of those from who I am. It's part of who I am. And so that's why it's identity first language. And I also understand the perspective of person first language because as educators, we want to respect the fact that the students that we have in our classroom, they're not defined by that label. But I do think it's important for us to check in with them and ask them, is it part of your identity? Mm-hmm. How do you feel about using that language? So I don't want to say anybody's wrong one way or the other, but I just want to encourage people to think about checking in and asking how people prefer to use that language.
I think that's a big piece of just the neurodiversity movement is about the depathologizing and destigmatizing of all of these labels and recognizing that variation is normal. That is the norm. There are differences between different people and different neurotypes, and recognizing that we can change some of those things. You'll notice that Amanda and I tend not to use terms like we don't say autism spectrum disorder. We'll say autism or autism spectrum. Or even when I was talking about obsessive compulsive thinking as opposed to obsessive compulsive disorder. But sometimes we slip, right? I mean, it's like I was trained and it's like sometimes I use person first language just because of the way the sentence is phrased. I mean, whatever. It's not a hard and fast rule, but we do like to give the context for what we're using and also just portraying the fact that language matters. So Amanda was talking about that identity first and person first language. And coming from education, there is one group of students where we almost always, use identity first language. And it's when we're talking about gifted students. Why is it okay to talk about gifted students, but we have to say a student with autism? It's because the language that we choose, the language that we use, conveys our values. It sends a message about what is right, what is wrong, what do we accept, what do we push away. And so just taking an opportunity to reflect on that a little bit can help us inform how we talk about all of these topics, which are very sensitive topics and can be difficult to address.
And Emily and I don't always agree on them, which is kind of interesting. And actually, what I think is unusual and really helpful about the book, right, is we have sections in each chapter where we're having conversations and you can see us discussing the topic at hand. And you'll hear the different perspectives we come from, the educator perspective, the clinician perspective, the generational perspective to some degree, having raised kids perspective. And we are doing that because we purposely want to say, like, we can agree on many things and still have places where there's still room for discussion. And one of the things that I'm hoping that this podcast does also is provide that room for discussion, not just with us, but with those of you who are listening. So you can start having those conversations amongst your colleagues and, really challenge our thinking in ways that maybe we haven't before.
Okay, to wrap up our episode today, we have a segment that we are calling the Circle Back. Because Amanda and I, this is kind of a funny thing. So for a couple of different reasons, those terms that we like to use in our faculty meetings, like, well, let's put a pin in it, or let's put that in the parking lot.
Or we're going to circle back to that.
We're going to circle back. To us, that's just very funny. We use those terms all the time because when we're like, I'm not really going to address that right now. We're going to
circle back to that.
We're going to come back to it. Also, for what it's worth, as neurodivergent people, our brains are often circling back to things. They're the topics. It's like, oh, wait, I forgot to say the thing about the thing, and now I'm going to circle back. But we thought that this would just be kind of a fun way to wrap up each episode and circle back to a couple of different takeaways, some things to think about as you go on. So what is the first takeaway for our circle back today, Amanda?
So the first idea I want to circle back to is something you raised, Emily, which is small but seismic shifts. You didn't say it necessarily like that, but what you said is it takes time. And I think it's really key for people to realize we're not asking you to implement everything all at the same time because that's just not doable and it's overwhelming. But small shifts can make seismic change. So whether it's shifting your language or it's shifting a piece of your mindset or it's shifting your understanding of neurodivergence versus neurodiversity, we want you to keep in mind that small can be seismic.
And the second circle back aligns very closely with that. And it really is about recognizing the effort and the time that it takes. It's going to take you time individually. It's going to take you time as you communicate with your colleagues and your coworkers, and recognizing, like Amanda said earlier, changes in the educational world happen slowly. I think in the neurodiversity realm, sometimes in businesses and in workplace, they're much quicker to adopt these things because they see the bottom line benefit to supporting neurodivergent people. But in school, change happens slowly. You want to get a new curriculum and you got to go through like 14 months worth of steps to, just even like bring it to the school board and who knows. And so be patient. I know that for a lot of us, especially those of us who see the change that could happen, it's hard to do that. But one step at a time, and recognize that those shifts do really take a lot of time and effort, but it'll be worth it.
Which I think brings us to the third takeaway in this circle back, which is the idea of finding like-minded community. Do not underestimate the power of having people who you can turn to who will support the same ideas and thoughts. Doesn't mean they have to agree on all of them, right? But finding people, finding your Emily, if you're Amanda, finding your Emily in that community who you can really start talking about how do you make these changes and feeling like you're supported is really, really key. Emily, do you want to talk about the community that we are part of?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a community. The Neurodiversity University is a platform where we have various professional development and training opportunities. And one of them is the Educator Hub. It is a membership community for educators who are dedicated to supporting neurodivergent learners. And so we've got a lot of people in there, from administrators to speech language pathologists to OTs, occupational therapists to educators to all of the different roles. And we have a lot of different events that we do every month, from webinars to office hours with me and Amanda to roundtable discussions, resources that you can share with your community, all of these different pieces within the Educator Hub. And for what it's worth, as you are listening to it, if you are interested, if you're curious, we're going to be opening up the doors right alongside the release of the book. So be on the lookout for that. And, if you're just curious about it, you can go to neurodiversity.university and click on the tab for Educator Hub. You can find out more information, or of course, click the link in the show notes.
And that like-minded community has been so encouraging, and
I love it.
I know.
I love it. I love talking to everybody. It's like I learned so much. It's like I know I'm kind of quote unquote in charge of it, but it really is a community where people have ideas for things, people have suggestions, and so we take those and we use those. But again, we have those office hours, we have those roundtable events, and I feel like I'm learning so much just from those conversations.
You'll learn more from our conversations on this podcast too. Today was an introduction to get to know sort of what we're talking about, what this book will be about, what this podcast will be about, who Emily and I are, and how our brains are going to bounce back and forth in these conversations. But stay tuned. We have so many great discussions coming for you.
We'll see you next time.